Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Gone South by Robert R. McCammon. Now, Gone South was published in 1991, and according to McCammon, this was meant to be sort of a follow-up to his novel Boy's Life, which was published earlier the same year. Now, both this and Boy's Life were sort of McCammon's attempts to move away from the horror genre, which at the time he was best known for. Now, Robert McCammon is also the author of books like Swan Song, Mine, Usher's Passing, Stinger, Speaks the Nightbird, and many others. Robert McCammon is definitely one of my favorite authors, and I think he's criminally underrated, and unfortunately at the time he was sort of dismissed as being a Stephen King imitator, which I think is grossly unfair. And in my opinion, he deserves to be just as well known as writers like Stephen King, Clive Barker, and Dean Koontz. Now, Gone South I thought was a very good book, but I'll admit there was a certain point in the novel where I wasn't really sure how I was feeling about it, because the novel starts off pretty straightforwardly, but then it takes a bizarre and kind of surreal turn, and when that happened, I wasn't sure how I was feeling about this, but eventually I came to appreciate what McCammon was doing, and it wasn't until I was more than halfway done with the book where I realized, holy shit, this is basically Wizard of Oz. This novel has a lot of parallels with The Wizard of Oz, and I would be very, very surprised if it turns out those parallels were just a coincidence. And the book is sort of a mix between a crime thriller, a black comedy, an action-adventure novel with a subtle undercurrent of the supernatural. But all of those elements are wrapped inside of this really sad and moving drama about a man who made a tragic mistake who is now trying to find peace. So, the plot of Gone South is we follow this man named Dan Lambert, who is a Vietnam veteran who is suffering from severe PTSD. We learn in the story that a few years prior to this, he actually almost killed his own son, because during one of his episodes, he thought he was in Vietnam again. And this, of course, caused his wife to leave him, and he's just trying to get by. He's working as a freelance carpenter, but he is recently been diagnosed with leukemia, most likely brought about by his exposure to Agent Orange. And he's also behind on his payments, so the bank is now threatening to take his truck away from him, which means he won't even be able to do his job to begin with. So he goes to the bank to plead his case, but the loan manager is hearing none of it. And then ultimately something just snaps in Dan, and he just goes ballistic on the loan manager and starts tearing the guy's office apart, which prompts the loan manager to call security. But when the security guard comes in there, Dan, who of course has military training, breaks the security guard's nose and immediately grabs the gun off him, which prompts the loan manager to grab his own gun out of his desk. So Dan ends up shooting the loan manager, immediately killing him. And when this happens, it's almost like Dan is immediately shocked back to reality and is like, oh fuck, what did I just do? So he immediately gets the fuck out of there and is now on the run, and later learns that a bounty has been placed on his head. So now Dan is fleeing south, possibly to Mexico, and he knows he's not long for this world because of the leukemia, and all he wants to do is live out the rest of his days in peace. So on his journey, Dan crosses paths with this young woman named Arden Holiday, who is looking for this faith healer whom she calls the Bright Girl, who supposedly lives in the swamps of Louisiana. Now, Dan thinks this is all bullshit, and he doesn't want this woman getting mixed up with him because he's of course a wanted fugitive, but circumstances kind of force them to travel together, and ultimately Dan is kind of roped into taken this woman down into the bayou to look for the bright girl. Meanwhile, Dan is being pursued by these two bounty hunters. Now, the point in the book where the story almost lost me was honestly the subplot with the bounty hunters, because we're following Dan's story, which is very compelling and so sad and tragic, and then we start following this bounty hunter named Flint, and Flint has a twin brother named Clint, but his twin brother is, I don't even want to say a conjoined twin. It's one of those deals where in utero, one twin absorbed the other twin, but not completely, and all that's left of this twin brother is literally an extra arm and a mouth on Flint's side. And I know there are real cases of this happening, but it felt so tonally off from what the novel initially set up at first. And in the novel, Flint's boss partners him up with a rookie named Pelvis Esley, who is a former Elvis Presley impersonator who's now trying to try his hand at bounty hunting, but doesn't really know what the fuck he's doing. And like I said, it initially took me out of the book because at first I'm reading this as this drama slash First Blood-esque thriller, and then all of a sudden it becomes this surreal comedy, like almost if David Lynch directed a buddy cop movie. But as the novel went on, I started to get really invested in the subplot with the bounty hunters to a point where their story became almost more compelling than Dan's story. And the character of Pelvis starts off really freaking annoying, and you kind of just want Flint to leave this guy in a motel, but as it goes on, this character goes through a freaking arc, and you learn there's so much more to this character than meets the eye, and we also learn that he has a really tragic backstory. And we see this character put through the freaking ringer in this novel, but he ends up proving himself to Flint, and actually ends up saving Flint's life at a few points in the story. And Flint is also a really interesting character who we realize has had a really hard life growing up with these deformities, and he was actually working as a circus freak before he became a bounty hunter. And you realize because of his deformities, he has suffered from bullying and abuse, so you definitely feel for this guy, even though he does start off the novel as basically the antagonist. Not in the sense that he's evil, but he's the antagonist simply by the fact that Dan is the protagonist, and he's going after Dan throughout most of the novel. But in the story, Flint and Pelvis end up running afoul of these drug smugglers in the bayou, and these drug smugglers end up becoming the villains by the end of the story. And really, in the novel, each of the main characters are dealing with their own personal pain and their own personal traumas, and ultimately their journey leads them to this bright girl. And like I said, the story has a lot of parallels with The Wizard of Oz. Arden is kind of the novel's equivalent of Dorothy, and she's going off to see the wizard, or the bright girl in this case, and Pelvis even has a dog, so you do have kind of a Toto equivalent in the story. And Dan, Flint, and Pelvis could be said to represent the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and the Lion. I'm not really sure which would be which, but again, this is sort of a modern reinterpretation of The Wizard of Oz. But yeah, Gone South is a really good book, as long as you know going in that the tone does kind of fluctuate between all these different genres. Like, it starts off as a drama, becomes kind of a black comedy, and towards the end becomes an outright action novel, where there's this shootout with all these drug dealers, which does get kind of freaking nuts. But if you're willing to go with it, it's actually a really good story. And when the novel focuses on Dan, there's definitely a commentary on the Vietnam War and the war's effects on American society and how veterans of that war were kind of cast aside. And there's definitely a commentary on PTSD. But ultimately, it becomes a story about hope and redemption. Now, I do wonder if a story like this would really fly today in today's current political climate, because nowadays we have all these mass shootings, and this novel is kind of a sympathetic portrait of a person who does commit. Granted, it's not a mass shooting, but it is still a shooting in a public place that leads to a death, and again, I'm not sure if this novel would really fly today. Like, if they tried to do a movie based on this book, they would have to do it very differently, I think. But the novel by no means condones what Dan did. But yeah, Gone South is a very good book, and I highly recommend it. It's not one of my favorite McCammon novels, but if you find this book, you should definitely give it a read. And definitely check out Robert McCammon's other novels as well. Like I said, he's a very talented and very underrated writer. But that was my review of Gone South by Robert McCammon, and bye.